They built 139 vacation cabins on my lake. One morning, I woke to the sound of construction equipment grinding through what had always been my sanctuary. The water, the trees, the quiet mornings, I had lost them all in a single summer. And the HOA? They didn't apologize. They didn't care. They just saw dollar signs and signed off on another cluster of cabins while I watched my peaceful world vanish. Every meeting, every warning, every letter from the HOA felt like another battle I was doomed to lose. Fines stacked up like bricks, rules were twisted to suit their whims, and the neighbors, once friendly faces, started whispering behind my back, siding with the people who had turned my life into chaos. It wasn't just my property at stake, it was my peace, my memories, my sense of fairness. And then, one evening, I realized the solution had been in my hands the whole time. A quiet, almost unimaginable way to fight back. But taking action could mean crossing lines I'd never imagined crossing, risking everything I had left. Would they see me coming? Or would I watch them destroy what I loved, powerless? I had to make a choice, and that choice would change everything. For years, the Martins had lived on Willow Lake, a quiet stretch of water framed by pine trees and dotted with modest cabins. Their mornings were predictable in the best way. The smell of fresh coffee drifting across the deck, the soft lapping of water against the dock, and the occasional loon calling out over the misty surface. Their children ran barefoot through the grass, chasing frogs and skipping stones, while the neighbors waved from across the lake. It was the kind of life many dream about, a small slice of peace far from the chaos of the city. Mr. Martin worked remotely, spending most of his days on video calls with clients, while Mrs. Martin tended to the garden and the small flower beds along the shoreline. They knew most of their neighbors by name, exchanged holiday cookies, and even shared tools when someone's dock needed repair. Life felt simple, contained, and safe, the way it should be. But beneath the calm surface, the Willow Lake Homeowners Association held a subtle grip over the community. Meetings were polite but stiff, and rules were often ambiguous, leaving room for interpretation. At first, it didn't bother the Martins. Rules about dock size, lawn maintenance, or exterior paint seemed reasonable, even helpful for keeping the neighborhood tidy. But a nagging sense lingered, an inkling that the HOA had more power than anyone admitted aloud. The first warning signs were small. A neighbor complained about a deck extension that had been there for years, citing a newly enforced violation in the HOA handbook. Another family received fines for leaving a rowboat on the shore overnight. The Martins dismissed it as overzealous bureaucracy at first. But then the news hit. The HOA had approved a massive project, 139 vacation cabins right along the lakefront, a stone's throw from the Martins' property. Overnight, their sanctuary risked vanishing beneath walls of new construction and the constant hum of power tools and generators. The community, once a quiet refuge, was now divided. Conversations that had been friendly turned tense, and longtime neighbors whispered in corners. The Martins felt the shift immediately, a subtle coldness in greetings, a new distance in the waves from neighbors they had known for decades, as though the very land they loved had turned against them, manipulated by rules and decisions they had no part in. And yet, life went on. Mornings still held the smell of coffee, the children still played near the water, and the Martins held on to the hope that things might settle. But every glance at the rising cabins on the horizon reminded them that the fight had already begun, even if they didn't fully understand the scale of what was coming. Something had stirred in the calm waters of Willow Lake, and it wasn't just the wind rippling the surface.
At first, the Martins tried to stay calm, believing that reason and patience would resolve the situation. They attended every HOA meeting, listening politely as board members rattled off rules and updates, their faces fixed in professional smiles. But it didn't take long to realize that the meetings were less about dialogue and more about control. Every suggestion, every objection, every plea to consider the impact on longtime residents was brushed aside with a mechanical nod or a dismissive, "We'll take it under advisement." The first official warning came in the form of a letter slipped under their door. It cited a violation. The dock, which had been perfectly fine for over a decade, supposedly encroached slightly into a newly defined buffer zone. The Martins measured, remeasured, and even asked for documentation, only to receive a vague response referencing an obscure section of the HOA handbook. Then the fines began, small at first, $100 here, $50 there, but they grew steadily, piling up with relentless efficiency. Each day, the Martins noticed changes along the shoreline. Survey stakes appeared without warning, marking where the first of the 139 vacation cabins would rise. Trees were cut down overnight, and trucks rumbled across the grass where children had played moments before. Neighbors they had trusted now passed with cold, polite nods, some even avoiding eye contact altogether. Rumors spread like wildfire. The HOA had promised perks to families who supported the project, discounts on community fees, early access to cabins. Those who resisted were quietly targeted. The tension escalated further when the Martins discovered that the HOA had authorized a private contractor to enforce compliance inspections. A man in a uniform began showing up unannounced, taking photos of the dock, the shoreline, even the garden, citing new rules about lawn height, pier alignment, and vegetation management. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, wondering which rule would suddenly be bent against them. Letters demanding corrections or threatening fines arrived daily, each one signed by a different board member, as if the entire community had mobilized against them. The breaking point came during a midsummer weekend. The Martins were hosting a small family gathering when a bulldozer appeared at the edge of their property line. The operator, claiming to act on HOA instructions, began clearing shrubs that had been there since the house was built. Mr. Martin ran to confront him, only to be met with a stack of documents threatening immediate fines and legal action if he interfered. The children, previously playing in the grass, watched wide-eyed as the machinery tore through what had once been their favorite hiding spots. Mrs. Martin's hands shook as she collected the scattered garden tools, the air thick with dust, tension, and disbelief. In the weeks that followed, the Martins began documenting everything. They took photos, recorded phone calls, and wrote down each encounter. Yet every step towards self-protection seemed to trigger more harassment. The HOA escalated, invoking new rules, restrictions on dock usage, limitations on watercraft, even citations for obstruction of lake views, a term that had never existed before. The Martins watched neighbors who once laughed with them now nod approvingly at each new infraction notice, silent witnesses to their growing frustration. And then came the rumors, strange, almost petty, but unmistakably coordinated. One neighbor accused the Martins of illegally dumping yard waste into the lake. Another claimed the family's dock lights were disturbing local wildlife, though the lights had been the same for years. The HOA circulated these allegations quietly, sending them via email and posting notices in community newsletters, subtly painting the Martins as troublemakers. Their reputation in the neighborhood began to fray like the edges of a worn carpet, and the emotional toll weighed heavier with each passing day. Despite the growing pressure, the Martins refused to back down. They researched the HOA's bylaws, discovering loopholes and legal gray areas that the board had overlooked. Yet even with knowledge on their side, every action felt like a gamble. Filing formal complaints led to counter-complaints. Requesting mediation prompted fines for disrupting community harmony. Each small victory was immediately followed by a new, unexpected challenge. Tension reached a peak fissure one evening when the Martins arrived home to find the edge of their docks sawed off. No notice, no explanation, just a clean, sharp cut where the dock had once extended into the water. The children cried, the dogs whined, and the Martins stared in disbelief at the handiwork. It was no longer about rules or fines. It was about control, power, and the realization that the community they had loved was now a battlefield. And yet, amid the frustration, a seed of determination grew. The Martins began quietly planning, weighing options, considering strategies that might give them leverage. There was a moment, late at night, sitting by the now damaged dock, the water reflecting the moonlight, when Mr. Martin muttered a thought that had been forming for weeks. If they think we'll just sit here and take it, they don't know us. Little did they know, that moment marked the beginning of a turning point. The rules, fines, and petty harassment had only strengthened their resolve. The escalating tension, once suffocating, would soon become the fuel for a daring response that the HOA would never see coming. But first, they had to endure one more wave of pressure, one more unfair demand, before the climax of this conflict could unfold. And as the Martins stared across the lake at the rows of half-built cabins, the question hung in the humid summer air. How far were they willing to go to reclaim what was theirs? And what would the HOA do when faced with someone who refused to back down?
The Martins had reached the edge of their patience. Every warning, every fine, every subtle act of intimidation had built into a storm they could no longer ignore. The HOA had grown bolder by the week, issuing new rules, threatening liens, and quietly rallying neighbors against them. But now, as the sun rose over Willow Lake, Mr. Martin realized that the time for patience had passed. Something had to be done, and it had to be decisive. The plan had been forming in quiet, tense meetings late at night. No one outside the family knew the full extent of it. They had studied the HOA's legal loopholes, pored over property maps, and traced every clause that could give them leverage. But tonight, it wouldn't just be about paperwork, it would be about action. It began with a quiet dawn. The Martins made their way to the edge of their property, the lake stretching placidly before them, hiding the chaos that to come. They moved swiftly, deliberately, ensuring no one had a chance to intervene. Mr. Martin had prepared tools, equipment, and materials that, until this morning, had been tucked safely away. The first step was subtle, a seemingly innocuous adjustment to the dam gates along the lake's inlet. It was legal, it was quiet, but it would force the HOA to confront the power they had taken for granted for so long. As the gates shifted, the water level began to rise inch by inch, just enough to reclaim territory that the construction crews had started to claim as theirs. Bulldozers stalled, survey stakes flooded. The first of the 139 vacation cabins, those symbols of intrusion, began to feel the invisible pressure of the lake asserting itself. The Martins moved with precision, every action deliberate, their hearts pounding as they watched the initial reactions from across the shore. And then came the confrontation. A group of HOA board members, including the president, arrived at the Martins' property, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fury. "You can't do this," one shouted. "You'll be fined. You'll be sued." But Mr. Martin didn't respond. Instead, he gestured toward the rising water, toward the cabins that had encroached on decades of private land, toward the very mess they had created by ignoring the Martins' warnings. "I didn't take anything from you," he said evenly. "I simply gave nature the chance to speak for itself." Chaos erupted. Board members scrambled to their vehicles, calling lawyers, threatening, but the Martins were already steps ahead. Evidence of prior violations, mismanaged approvals, and inconsistent application of rules had been meticulously documented. Photographs, dates, and video recordings lined the edge of the property. Every petty rule, every manipulated clause, every unfair fine became ammunition. The HOA's confidence began to crumble in real time, replaced by frantic attempts to regain control. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some stood silently, shocked, while others whispered behind fingers, realizing perhaps for the first time that the Martins had been telling the truth all along. The families who had once sided quietly with the HOA now faced a choice: either continue supporting the board or acknowledge the absurdity of the overreach. The tension was palpable, a living thing that seemed to pulse with the rising water. Inside the HOA, panic mounted. The president barked orders, but nothing moved fast enough. Survey stakes were already underwater. Construction equipment couldn't reach certain areas. Legal threats seemed impotent against the immediate physical reality of the lake reclaiming what had once been its own. Each minute brought a new wave of anxiety for the board, a growing sense that control had slipped beyond their grasp. As midday approached, the climax reached its peak. The Martins, standing shoulder to shoulder, watched as the first cabin's foundations were partially submerged. Bulldozers stalled on soggy ground, crews unsure of whether to proceed. Board members pleaded, threatened, and argued, but the Martins held their ground. It wasn't just a fight over property anymore. It was a confrontation between years of arrogance, entitlement, and abuse of authority versus determination, principle, and ingenuity. Then came the final symbolic moment. Mr. Martin, looking across the water, let out a slow, deliberate whistle. From a distance, the children began launching rowboats, tiny reminders of the life that had existed here before the HOA's encroachment. Their laughter echoed across the lake, piercing the tension, drawing the eyes of neighbors who had remained silent for too long. It was a statement. The lake wasn't just water, the cabins weren't just wood and nails, and the Martins weren't just a family. They were the guardians of their home, of fairness, and of justice in a place that had forgotten what those words meant. Board members, now visibly shaken, tried to regain composure, but it was too late. The Martins' methodical resistance had exposed the HOA's mismanagement to everyone present. The press of neighbors, the undeniable presence of evidence, the immediate literal reclaiming of the land, it all culminated in an image the board couldn't erase. Power misused, challenged, and finally humbled. But even as the victory surged through the Martins, the moment wasn't entirely over. The water had shifted, but the fight was not done. Legal battles would follow, letters would still arrive, and the HOA would seek retribution. The climax wasn't the end, it was the turning point, the reckoning, the dramatic apex of years of tension. But it had been decisive. The Martins had shown that careful planning, courage, and moral clarity could confront an entrenched bureaucracy, even when that bureaucracy seemed untouchable. Standing on their dock, watching the partially submerged cabins, Mrs. Martin turned to her husband. "Do you think this will finally make them understand?" she asked. Mr. Martin's gaze didn't leave the water. "I don't know if they'll ever understand," he said softly. "But I do know this: we're not backing down, and neither should anyone who faces the same injustice." And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the lake, the Martins felt the weight of the fight they had endured, but also the undeniable surge of triumph. The water had done what words couldn't. Nature had spoken. And finally, the world had to listen. Yet even in victory, the question lingered in the air. Would the HOA recover, regroup, and strike back? Or had they finally met someone who wouldn't be intimidated, bullied, or silenced? The answer hung in the quiet tension of the evening, a question that would carry forward into the resolution.
The dust had settled, both literally and figuratively. The sun rose over Willow Lake, casting a golden glow on the water, now reflecting the quiet aftermath of the confrontation. The cabins, partially submerged and abandoned, stood as silent monuments to the HOA's overreach, a visible reminder that even the most entrenched bureaucracy could be challenged. For the Martins, the immediate danger had passed, but the resolution of their struggle wasn't just about the physical landscape, it was about reclaiming peace, fairness, and a sense of control over their own lives. In the weeks that followed, the HOA scrambled to respond. Lawyers were called, letters flew back and forth, and meetings were scheduled in rapid succession. Yet each time the board tried to assert authority, they found themselves facing a meticulously documented record of mismanagement, inconsistent enforcement of rules, and outright abuses of power. The Martins' evidence was airtight. Photographs of illegal clearings, videos of construction encroaching on private property, and a detailed timeline of fines and harassment. Even the neighbors who had initially stayed silent began to speak, offering testimonies about rules being selectively enforced, favoritism, and intimidation. By the end of the first month, the HOA was forced to hold a special meeting open to all residents. What had once been a room full of tense, closed-door authority now felt exposed under the collective scrutiny of the community. Board members attempted to justify their decisions, but the Martins' calm presentation of facts left little room for debate. Questions came from unexpected corners. Neighbors they hadn't even known were paying attention, probing inconsistencies and demanding accountability. The board's confidence wavered, their once commanding presence reduced to awkward explanations and nervous glances. For the Martins, the victory was twofold. Not only had they halted the immediate construction that threatened their home, but they also reshaped the community's understanding of power and fairness. Policies began to change. Several rules were amended to ensure transparency and consistency. The HOA could no longer act unilaterally or manipulate vague clauses without facing scrutiny. For the first time in years, residents felt their voices mattered, and the Martins had become the unlikely catalysts for a broader cultural shift within Willow Lake. The children, who had watched the confrontation unfold with wide-eyed wonder, began reclaiming their play spaces along the shoreline. Rowboats returned to the water, the dock became safe again, and the garden, once threatened by fines and arbitrary rules, bloomed like never before. Even neighbors who had been hesitant or fearful approached the Martins, offering thanks and apologies for remaining silent while injustice went unchecked. The lake, once a stage for conflict, returned to being a place of quiet reflection and childhood memories. Yet the Martins knew that lasting impact required vigilance. They continued to attend HOA meetings, now not as victims, but as informed, active residents. Every proposed project, every new rule was carefully reviewed, with the Martins acting as guardians of fairness. Their role evolved from homeowner to community watchdog, ensuring that the abuses they had endured would not repeat for anyone else. Other families began documenting incidents, inspired by the Martins' example, and the neighborhood gradually shifted toward transparency and accountability. But the resolution wasn't just administrative, it was deeply personal. For Mr. and Mrs. Martin, the struggle had tested their endurance, patience, and sense of justice. The confrontation with the HOA had forced them into uncharted territory, confronting authority with strategy and courage rather than brute force or anger. They emerged stronger, more confident in their rights, and more united as a family. They had learned that standing firm, even against a seemingly insurmountable system, could yield results, and that careful preparation, resilience, and calm determination were more powerful than fear or frustration.
Emotionally, the impact was profound. The stress of months of harassment had taken a toll, but the satisfaction of reclaiming their home, their dignity, and their peace of mind was immense. The children could now grow up without the shadow of arbitrary authority looming over every play session, and neighbors were reminded of the importance of fairness, respect, and community solidarity. The Martins' story spread quietly but effectively, a cautionary tale of vigilance and empowerment, a lesson that others could draw upon when facing similar challenges. For the HOA, the consequences were equally significant. Leadership changes followed as frustrated residents demanded accountability. Policies were rewritten, fines were scrutinized, and communication channels opened in ways that had never existed before. The board's credibility had been shaken. No longer could they act without oversight or assume that longtime residents would remain silent.
Even the reputation of the association outside Willow Lake was affected, as local news outlets picked up the story, highlighting both the overreach and the eventual triumph of ordinary homeowners. Yet, amid the victory, the Martins reflected on what had truly made the difference. It wasn't anger or revenge. It was preparation, documentation, and the willingness to act decisively when the moment demanded it. They realized that many disputes festered because homeowners felt powerless, unsure of their rights, or afraid to confront authority. By taking careful steps, remaining calm under pressure, and using evidence as their weapon, they had shifted the balance of power. Their story became a blueprint for others facing similar battles, a reminder that even a single family could change the course of a community when armed with courage and knowledge. Months later, Willow Lake was transformed. The cabins were never completed, the construction crews reassigned, and the shoreline remained protected. The water lapped peacefully against the dock, the garden thrived, and the family could finally enjoy the mornings they had once taken for granted. The HOA meetings, once sources of dread, became forums for constructive dialogue, transparency, and compromise. Rules existed, yes, but they were applied fairly, and residents could trust that their voices mattered. Looking back, Mrs. Martin often thought about the day it had all changed, the morning when the water began to reclaim what had been taken. It felt like the lake was standing with us, she said quietly one evening, watching the sunset reflect on the calm surface. Mr. Martin nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. The fight had been long, exhausting, and emotionally draining, but the result was not only personal victory, it was a reshaping of the entire community's moral compass. The takeaway, they realized, wasn't just about lakes, docks, or cabins. It was about agency, about refusing to accept injustice, about standing firm when bureaucracy overreaches, and about finding ways to reclaim control without losing integrity. Their story became a testament to what ordinary people could achieve when prepared, persistent, and principled. As the Martins sat on their dock, the sun dipping below the horizon, a gentle breeze carried the quiet promise of the future. Their lake, once a battleground, had become a symbol of resilience, courage, and the enduring power of standing up for what is right. The questions that had haunted them, the fears, the doubts, the uncertainty, had been answered not with brute force, but with clarity, courage, and action. And so, the lake remained peaceful, the cabins unfinished, and Willow Lake itself seemed to breathe a collective sigh of relief. The Martins had won more than a dispute. They had restored balance, defended their home, and reminded everyone that even in the face of relentless authority, fairness, dignity, and persistence could prevail. As they watched the last light fade across the water, Mrs. Martin whispered, "We did it." Mr. Martin smiled, looking out over the lake. Yes, and maybe now others will see that standing up is worth it. The story of Willow Lake would live on, a reminder that power unchecked can be challenged, that community matters, and that one family's courage could inspire change far beyond their own backyard. The lake had reclaimed more than land. It had restored hope, fairness, and the belief that even the smallest voices could echo loudly when used wisely.